and also sex trafficking. So when I came on with the city in 2016, I was able to work in a really kind of unique capacity that not a lot of not a lot of other cities in the country have kind of started this. So essentially, I was a human trafficking victim advocate, and I was embedded in the Phoenix Police Department's Vice unit. So if you know anything about what, like Miami Vice, the TV show, Vice units and police departments specifically focus on issues around commercial sexual exploitation, which a lot of us know to be prostitution. Um, and so when you think about when police are contacting people who are, um, in prostitution, doing sex work, we realize that that is probably the number one place where you're going to find the sex trafficking victims, right? So, so what I was able to do was I was embedded fully within their unit, and every single person that the police contacted, suspected of prostitution or, like we're going to talk about anyone who's under 18 who is suspected of this kind of activity, I was able to offer them services immediately. So it was a very productive relationship. So to kind of tell you guys a little bit about what sex trafficking is exactly, because we do have so many different misinformation campaigns out there. Um, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of the year 2000 specifically outlines sex trafficking to be the recruiting, harboring, transportation, provision, or of obtaining of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act. And a commercial sex act can be anything from stripping, sex for money, trading sex for something of value. So that can include even a person who has to trade sex to pay their rent for where they're living. So there's a lot of variety in commercial sex act. Um, so if the person is an adult, it's considered sex trafficking if the person is induced to perform the sexual acts by force, fraud, or coercion, or any person under the age of 18 years old. So essentially, what that means is there is no such thing as any underage person willingly being in prostitution or having to trade sex acts for something of value. So, a lot of times you might have heard the term child prostitute or something like that. There is no such thing. There is no, a person who is under 18 cannot legally consent to sex, even if they're getting paid for it. They cannot legally consent to that. So that's a huge takeaway that I want you guys to think about throughout this presentation. So breaking down what that definition looks like. So adults who are induced to exchange sex through force, fraud, or coercion. So some examples that you might think about for coercion, for example. So that would be a situation whereby like a homeless person might be initially offered a place to stay, and they're thinking this person's going to help me, and nothing's expected in exchange. And then upon their arrival, the good person who's going to be helping them is now saying, you have to have sex with me in order to stay here. So that's a prime example of coercion. Um, an example of force, so this one's a little bit more obvious. You might think of, maybe like if you see a movie from the 70s where you have like a pimp, who is beating a victim and forcing them to work and give them money. That is one example of force. um, but I also want to kind of present a different idea of what force can look like, because, again, throughout this presentation, I'm hoping to kind of show you some different situations that are maybe not what people think of as either, a sex trafficking victim who's abducted and thrown into a van in the middle of the night, but also not just traditional prostitution. There's a lot of different ways that commercial sex acts can take place. So another situation whereby a person can be forced would be a situation where you have, a couple who are both addicted to drugs. And, one of the partners of the couple is forcing the other to go out and exchange sex for drugs and bring, more drugs back to the original partner. Well, that partner who has essentially forced them to do that is a sex trafficker. Um, and that's another reason why it can be so difficult sometimes for victims themselves to even recognize that they have been trafficked. And then, so a really amazing, I mean, it's a very sad, but a really prime example of fraud was with a victim that I worked with about 3 years ago, who she was what I would consider a very regular girl, regular girl in her early 20s. She was a single mom. Um, she had had a previous domestic violence relationship. She had a lot of medical problems, a lot of bills. And she saw an advertisement to work for a modeling agency, and with no fine print, it wasn't, laundry model or anything like that. She just went in to apply for a modeling agency. When she arrived, she was given totally normal, paperwork to fill out to work for this company. The company had actually been around for over 30 years operating in Phoenix. And so, as part of her, employment paperwork, she also had to fill out information about her child. So, social security number, home address, all of the most intimate information that she could have possibly given to anybody. And um, within a week, her new employer said, sorry, you're not just going to be doing normal modeling here. You're going to be doing hardcore acts. You're going to be having sex for money. And it turns out that this employer even forced her to participate in really hardcore sex acts, including getting beaten. It turned into her living hell. Thankfully, though, because of the way that the federal definition of sex trafficking is written, he did end up getting sentenced to, I think, 50 years in prison. So that's how we can see, the force, fraud, and coercion. Those are just some, real life examples of kind of what those look like. So we also know from the federal definition that any person under 18 exchanging sex for anything of value, including a place to stay, including a ride in a car, including a sandwich. It could be anything. Any person under 18 who is exchanging sex for something of value is a sex trafficking victim. And this does include, the kids who believe they're doing it willingly. The kids who run away from home and they decide to start doing this to get money. That's not how it works. It's always the adult's job to never sexually engage with a minor because they cannot legally consent to sex no matter what. So, what are some risk factors for how people can end up getting sucked into this, and what are the vulnerabilities? So, some of the main ones that we see, family instability is a huge one, especially when you even consider how family instability is a precursor for a lot of things, not just sex trafficking. So, when you have a domestic violence relationship, for example, and you have an unstable family, you don't have anyone that you can tell what's going on to. Maybe you don't have family members that can be trusted. Maybe you don't have family that you can live with or stay with because that situation might be unsafe as well. So that's a huge risk factor. Also, poverty. Um, we had so many of my former clients who would actually, because of poverty, they were essentially deciding to, sell sex for money. And what ended up happening was that pimps and traffickers would then target them and, strong arm them essentially. So, they might have thought they were just doing this temporarily or just to pay, some bills, but very quickly the trafficker was taking them over. Gang involvement. A lot of people talk about, have heard about gangs trafficking in people, and that's absolutely true. But a lot of times, what it looks like is that, a person is involved with a gang, and everybody involved in the gang is trying to do something to make money for the gang. So maybe one person might be selling drugs, another person might be selling sex. There's also different power differentials, especially in gangs with how women are treated. So, their involvement in the gang might end up being their partner who's a gang member who forces them to do this. Um, Another huge risk factor is a history of abuse. I think, this is not a scientific study, but I would say 90% of the sex trafficking victims, or more, possibly more, had child sex abuse in their background, many under the age of 10 years old. So these are, if you know anything about kind of how trauma affects the brain and how past experiences affect us into adulthood, a lot of people, when they're sexually abused as a child, they don't learn kind of what love is supposed to look like. They don't learn what healthy, sexual activity is, and it makes them very vulnerable to somebody coming in and trafficking them. Trauma, again, when you're impacted throughout your life with, continued traumatic experiences, it just makes you a lot more easy to control. Child welfare involvement. There is what the only word that I would be able to describe is there is an epidemic of kids being sex trafficked who are already in the care of DCS. And that's not always, foster parents or, kind of what immediately comes to mind, but there's, when you think about the kids that are already in DCS care, they've got a lot of the risk factors that I just described, right? History of abuse, maybe substance abuse, family instability, poverty, gang involvement. They're kind of like the ultimate target for traffickers. And there have been a lot of instances where traffickers will literally sit outside of a group home and they'll watch them walk by. And I'm not talking about abducting them. I'm talking about that they are looking for the most, I'm not sure what the word is, the most pliable sort of victim. And what they do is they befriend them. They're not abducting them, they're befriending them. They're saying, hey, I notice, you don't have a lot of clothes. You wear the same clothes all the time. Maybe I can get you some new clothes. It's a grooming process that takes place. Um, and finally, sexual orientation is also a risk factor. Um, and some of the reasons for that, I know that the ASU School of Social Work, they have an amazing department there. It's called the Sex Trafficking Intervention and Research Office. And they're currently doing a lot more research about why sexual orientation can be a risk factor. Previously, we thought that it might be because of family alienation. So parents that are not accepting or maybe kicking them out. But in some of the recent studies, they're finding that there might be different reasons for that. So if you are interested in that, please, after this, reach out to me and I can try to find you more information. So some of the different types of traffickers, or I think a word that I prefer is sort of structure of trafficking. These are there's a lot of different ways that this can look, but these are some of the primary ways that we see it look. First, we have familial trafficking. So that is where a parent or relative, someone within their own household, essentially, is exploiting them. And a lot of times, what we see that look like is when there's a substance addicted parent who, may be essentially trading their own children in order to get money or just straight up trade for drugs. We've seen situations where, as just a last resort out of poverty, a parent or relative will traffic their child. Um, I know there's a situation where um, there was a mother who basically at the last day of every single month, she would have her 7-year-old, unfortunately have sexual contact with their landlord in order to cover, the gap of what she couldn't afford for rent. So there's a lot of different ways that that can look. But one thing that we have seen with familial trafficking is that it's often misidentified. It's either misidentified or just not identified. And a lot of the victims don't even disclose to it until they're much older, possibly, in their 20s or 30s when they're, starting to undergo therapy and they're and learning, what trafficking is, because prior to that they didn't even understand. Sometimes it can be misidentified as child molestation, and it is very similar. However, as soon as you introduce the element of something being exchanged, something of value being exchanged, that is what makes it become trafficking. Um, so I had kind of already touched on gangs a little bit, but uh, a lot of times what we've seen with traffickers, with gangs in relation to sex trafficking, is once again, it's not necessarily that the gang themselves are, participating in a network of sex trafficking, and they can, but a lot of times what we see it look like is that individual gang members are trafficking in people. So they might be selling drugs, selling guns, and then also trafficking in people too. Because essentially their main focus is whatever they can do to make themselves money. Um, so situational vulnerability. So that is going to be that is one that is incredibly sad and difficult to work with the victims, because a lot of times what they're dealing with is um, survival. They're trying to survive, and sometimes they have a legitimate laundry list of problems that they just don't have answers for. When you have let's say a person who might be undocumented, they, might be homeless, they have, more children than they can feed, um, and, you can provide them resources for different, community organizations. But, you know, when they're saying, well, this is my bill, how am I going to pay it? Sometimes they can end up being trafficked that way. Regarding, what is historically known as the pimp. And by the way, pimp is still the accurate word to use for, that is still what victims refer to them as. We tend to see two different kinds of pimps. Um, so first we see the Romeo pimp. So the Romeo pimp is the pimp who starts a personal relationship with that victim. And that may be a friendship, it might be a romantic relationship. It is basically the relationship where they are getting the victim to trust them. They are instilling hope in them. They're making promises to them, and, there may be an element of romance. They might even end up having children together, So this is where the kind of the claws get stuck into the victim in ways that make it very difficult for them to get away, because these are a lot of the victims that don't recognize their victimization. And in fact, because they have the trust and the love relationship with that pimp, um, they might even think that they chose to do everything. They might think that they're a willing person in prostitution, you know? Um, with this group of people and of clients, I think this can be where it's very helpful to be sharing information about domestic violence, sharing information about, the definition of trafficking. So the other kind of pimp that we see is called the gorilla pimp. And this is going to be the pimp who really relies on the force and They might be abducting the victim. They might be, um, they are probably beating the victim, and these are the ones who, again, they're very hard to get away from, but a lot of times the victim is more afraid to leave them. Whereas with the Romeo pimp, sometimes it's more because they love them, you know. So moving on. So what are some possible signs of trafficking? What can you be looking for? Either, within your, if you're working with someone or maybe someone in your family and your friends, what can you be looking for? Um, Homelessness and kids who chronically run away um, are huge signs of trafficking. But it's more of a chicken before the egg kind of situation with this one. Is running away and homelessness are more the triggers for someone to be possibly trafficked. Because it makes them more vulnerable. So it's not always that they're running away from the trafficking. It's more that, during runaway, that is when they become more vulnerable. Um, and actually, one of the notes that I have right here is it's really, really sad, but 1 out of 3 runaway youth on the street will be lured into prostitution within 48 hours of leaving home. So when you really think about how powerful of a number that is and how massive of a group of kids that is, um, that's how we see, an epidemic of trafficking in kids. You'll also see a history of abuse, um, and again, it's sometimes is the abuse coming from the trafficker, or is the abuse the precipice for them to make them run away and then end up being trafficked? Either way, it's really important that we keep an eye on people who are showing these kinds of signs. Unusual tattoos and branding marks. So, some of the tattoos that you'll see in the sex trafficking world include tattoos with dollar signs or tattoos implying ownership of, by someone else. So, if I show up to school and I have a tattoo that says, Johnny's girl, or King Johnny's girl, and that's kind of an unusual tattoo. I didn't even know you have someone in your life named Johnny. Can you tell me about that? Um, these are some of the signs that, what I like to talk about with the red flags of trafficking is once you learn sort of what they can look like and some of the language, it's like you'll all of a sudden you'll start to see it a lot more often. It's kind of like one of those things where you don't notice it until you learn about it, and then all of a sudden you go, wow, I remember that person had a tattoo like that. um, Using street language with references, I mean, there's actually a lot of different words that kind of fall into the what I call the subculture of trafficking. But some of the main words to look for are when people are referencing either the game or the life. So the way that somebody would use that is, I've been in the life for 5 years, or, I'm going to introduce him to the game, you know. So these are kind of some words that, once again, if you don't know what they are, you would never hear them. But once you know what those words are, you start to hear it. Another huge sign of trafficking is uh, dominating or controlling. On here we have boyfriend, but I just want to remind you that there is every possible combination of genders regarding trafficking. You can have male trafficker, female trafficker, male victim, female victim, trans. We see it all. So, but a dominating or controlling partner who refuses to leave during an interview, or just the presence of a significantly older partner. Um, but really, it's just having, when you have this omnipresent person who doesn't really let the possible victim speak, it's just something to be, it's just a little suspect. So also involvement with the juvenile justice system through truancy, curfew violations, and other status offenses. So this is really important for us to consider because A lot of people who are being trafficked, they might not be entering the justice system through, prostitution charges or things that are otherwise more obvious that this might be going on. A lot of times, um, you know, they're the trafficking might just be one part of what's happening to them, but they might also be, being forced to shoplift or any number of crimes like that. There's actually a term that's called forced criminality. So essentially, that is when other people are forcing them to commit crimes. That might be, scams where they're going to a department store and stealing and then returning the clothes. There's a lots of different kinds of scams, but essentially, what it is that trafficker is forcing them to make money in multiple ways. So now that I've kind of given you some ideas about what sex trafficking is and kind of what it looks like, I want to tell you kind of what we're doing about it. So I don't want to leave you on a negative note. So, like I said, we started the Compass Plan in about 5 years ago. And what the Compass Plan does is it establishes the city of Phoenix. Um, excuse me, I'm blocking my own screen. It establishes the city of Phoenix as a model in addressing and combating human trafficking. And to meet this goal, we adopted and implemented what is called the Compass Plan. So essentially, what that is a plan that is comprehensive, collaborative, and community wide, persistently focused on innovation and culture changing. So what we did when we were sitting down to figure out exactly what would a plan look like to, be able to change something on such a large scale. We're the fifth or sixth largest city in the country at this point. So we decided to focus on four key areas. So we focus on law enforcement, victim services, training, and awareness and outreach. And we've been able to, by focusing on these four pieces, we've been able to make little changes over the last 5 years that have actually had some pretty impressive results. Um, Another part of the Compass Plan is that we run the Mayor's Human Trafficking Task Force. So, our chair and co chair of the task force are actually Councilman Jim Waring, and this is Cindy McCain. And if you don't know about Cindy McCain's work around trafficking, I beg you to look into it. In addition to, all of the fundraising that she does for trafficking, she has been just a huge advocate on the national scale and actually on the international scale for many years. So we owe her a lot for that. A few things that we've been able to do over the years. We participated in the Arizona Not Buying It campaign, um, and as a part of that, we were able to bring some really heavy hitters, including local celebrities, top-ranking law enforcement, council people, and we participated in the messaging of Arizona is not buying it. And what that focuses on is that if you didn't have people who were willing to buy sex, you wouldn't have anyone who was selling sex. So that's the concept of we have to reduce demand in order to reduce the supply. So that was a really incredible campaign. As part of that, um, we've been able to do a lot of things that bring awareness throughout the community, both in the month of January and throughout the year. So, we've been able to have billboards. We've been able to, light all the buildings blue. Blue is the Human Trafficking Awareness Month color in January. We have signs on garbage trucks. And one of the projects that Cindy McCain really helped us on was getting these signs in every airport bathroom, so that if people were being trafficked and they're in the airport, that they have a hotline number to call in every single bathroom. So that was a really great one. And as I told you earlier, my former job was made available by Victims of Crime Act funding. So they were able to fund having a human trafficking victim advocate who specifically focuses just on people who are involved in this world and making sure that they're able to get services immediately. Because historically, police officers, as much as we wish they could be all the time, they're not social workers. And they don't have the ability to memorize every single resource on the planet, especially not every human trafficking resource that's available. So when you have an advocate who is their full-time work is to know those resources, you're able to help the survivors so much more quickly and just more successfully. Another amazing event that we've been able to do is for the last 6 years, we've been able to hold a huge drop-in center at the Helen Drake Senior Center, which is on 27th Avenue, twice a year. And so at those drop-in centers, people who either were trafficked, are trafficked, or really any person who's involved or ever been prostituted is allowed to come in, and we have food and clothes and housing resources, medical and mental health care, HIV and Hep C testing, drug and alcohol treatment, basically every possible resource. And we have so many volunteers who come and help out, and it's been so amazing. And we've been able to serve about 354 clients since 2014, which is really huge. So we also do a lot of trainings and presentations. Specifically, I do. But it's wonderful. We've been able to train law enforcement officers, judges, detention officers, DCS social workers, providers who work with kids who are aging out of foster care. We've really, every place that we can get in to provide this information. I just look at it as another group of people who now know that there's no such thing as a child prostitute, right? There's so much misinformation, and just being able to share even the basic definitions can be really, really important and really life-changing for people. I've had a lot of trainings where people come up to me and say, you know what, this is going to sound crazy, but I think I've been trafficked before. Or, I've been having problems with my daughter, and I think, she might be trafficked, and I'm going to have a conversation with her now. So it's really good information. And even, hopefully you never have to use this information, but if you do, I'm hoping that you can help somebody else with it. And another really huge thing that we've been able to achieve with the task force is we were able to change the city code. I want to make sure I read this properly for you guys. January 2015, we were able to change the city code, which amended arrests of sex buyers. So we're not talking the people who are selling sex, we're talking about the buyers of sex. Amended the city code to include an educational component to the mandatory sentence for violations. And then also in 2018, there's now a mandatory vehicle impound for 30 days for sex buyers. So, it might not sound like a huge deal, but I want you to think about this. When a person is caught, arrested, trying to buy sex from someone, and they don't know if that person's an adult or a child, okay? When you impound their car for 30 days, what are they going to be telling their wife about that? How are they going to explain that to their employer, right? So these are little ways that, I can guarantee you that that particular sex buyer will probably not be buying sex again anytime soon. And if any of you know whose picture is on the screen, this is Warren Sapp, and he was one of the first. He's an NFL player, and he was one of the first people to be arrested under this code, which was huge and really went quite far in showing people this is what can happen when you are trying to buy sex in Phoenix, and that we don't tolerate it. So that is all I have. I tried to keep it under 45 minutes, so we will have a little bit of time for questions if anybody has any. But again, my name is Sarah Way. My email address is sarah.way@phoenix.gov. And please feel free to reach out to me if you either want to talk about this further, or if you might want a training for a group or anything like that. Are there any questions?
All right. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
So next week next week's speaker topic will be about basic auto care maintenance, and this will be on October 7th at 12 p.m. Make sure to pre-register for the link just as you did this week, and we hope to see you all again next week. Is there any questions from tonight? All right. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. Have a good night.
You too. Bye-bye.
Thanks.